Hello everybody. It's a very great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight for an event that could hardly be more timely. We're going to be talking about Indonesia as our newly re-elected Prime Minister makes his way to Jakarta for the first visit since the re-election of 10 days ago to any foreign country, and that's very much as it should be. Our speaker, Natalie Sambi, could hardly be more expert. Her positions, and I'm sure you've seen all this, but I'll quickly summarise. She's founder and executive director of Verve Research, an independent think tank focused on the relationship between militaries and societies in Southeast Asia. She's a senior policy fellow at the Asia Society Australia and a non-resident fellow with the Brookings Institution's Foreign Policy Program. Natalie works as a lecturer at the Australian War College for Deakin University, convening modules for the Australian Command and Staff College. She holds a PhD from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University, and above all is a tremendous expert on Indonesia who makes a real mark in our community in addressing these important issues. Last but not least, she's a former president of the Australian Institute of International Affairs ACT branch. It's over to Dr. Sam.
Thank you so much, Ian. Terima kasih. Selamat malam semua. Is anyone here speak Indonesian or Malay? Yeah, shout out to my people. Boleh faham. Okay, baik. Terima kasih, Pak. All right, first my thanks to the Gadigal people. I'm very grateful that we can meet here tonight. My heartfelt thanks to AWA New South Wales. It's nice to be back here after 12 or 14 so years. To Ian and to Jennifer, to meeting the lovely interns this evening, to Ralph for helping me set up. I appreciate that. Also, thank you to friends, to colleagues and Indonesia enthusiasts. Thank you for making time on a Tuesday evening to learn more about one of our most important neighbours. And last, to the Indonesian people. Thank you, and may you live long and prosper under President Prabowo and beyond. So let me just set a little bit of the scene, since we are talking about Indonesia. Indonesia is a country of 280 million people spread across 17,000 islands, with immense religious, socio-economic, ethnic, racial and linguistic diversity. It's a country that's only been independent since 1945, and proudly so, a democracy since 1998, and has survived several financial crises as well as insurgencies, terrorism and rebellions. It's located in the Ring of Fire, and so is susceptible to a number of natural disasters that are exacerbated by climate change, and it is positioned between two oceans, two continents, and is responsible for between a quarter and a third of the world's maritime-borne trade. Last but not least, not only is it a rising economy, it is our most important strategic neighbour to our north. And what about President Prabowo Subianto? Who is he? At 73 years old, he is a former Special Forces officer and former son-in-law of President Suharto. He won with 58% in the popular vote in one round in last year's election on Valentine's Day to become Indonesia's 8th president, and he will serve for a term of 5 years. He comes from what my friend Dr. Jackie Baker would call a blue blood family. He comes from a very privileged background. His father and his grandfather were influential in politics, economics and banking. In fact, his grandfather set up one of the early banks in Indonesia. Prabowo is a multilingual man, and he is highly educated and highly intelligent, and he is well respected by the soldiers, the Special Forces soldiers in particular, who served under him. But make no mistake, this man has also been accused of human rights violations, particularly the kidnappings of activists during 1998. Most recently, he served as Indonesia's defence minister, so he has had some time in cabinet. But most importantly, he likes cats. Now, if you would like to know a little bit more about Prabowo and his background and why it's so salient about the way that he governs, I would recommend Dr. Jackie Baker's essay on him in the not-so-recent issue of Australian Foreign Affairs. Her essay is called Forcing History, Prabowo and the New Deal for Indonesia Elites, and it's one of the readings for my students. So, coming to today's topic, a lot has happened in 200 days. I have tried to figure out a way to condense how I'm going to talk about 6 months of the Prabowo administration in 30 minutes. So what I plan to do is look at 3 levels of analysis. I'm going to look at a major policy that affects the people and the welfare of Indonesia. I'm going to take that up to the state level and look at a major policy that affects the bureaucracy and the relationship between society and the state. And last but not least, I'm going to look at a couple of the major foreign policy developments. We're going to take that right up to the international as well. And last but not least, we're going to talk about what that means for us as well. So this is to give you a cross-section of the complexity of the Prabowo administration in its first 200 days and to give you a little bit more depth about our most important strategic neighbour to the north. Okay, first things first, we're going to talk a little bit about economics. So by no means I'm not an economist, but we are going to talk about this important policy of the Prabowo administration, his keystone policy of the Free Nutritious Meals Program, the Makan Bergizi Gratis. So what is it? In essence, the program attempts to redress the effects of stunting amongst Indonesian children. Now, for those who are not so sure what that is, according to the World Health Organization, stunting is the impaired growth and development that children experience from a lack of nutrition, repeated infection, and inadequate psychosocial stimulation. So the Free Meals Program is trying to address that first element of poor nutrition. Now, in Indonesia, just over 1/5, so 21.5% of Indonesian children under the age of 5 are considered to be stunted. Now, in reference in terms of the region in Southeast Asia, Thailand is on the lower side at just about 13%, with Laos at about 33%, with most other Southeast Asian states around 20%. So Indonesia is falling within that median group. Nevertheless, 1 in 5 children who are stunted is not an enviable figure, and that is something the government is trying to reduce down to 14%, with the recognition that the first 1,000 days of a child's life from conception to age of 2 are the most critical for their physical and their cognitive development as well. So this program is set up to run for 5 years and is intended to reach 89 million children, but also breastfeeding and pregnant mothers at a cost of around $45 billion, although I've seen other estimates have put it at about $7 billion Australian, or another figure had it at about $53 million a day, US, which is roughly, over the span of 5 years, $1 trillion. So you can imagine in a country of 280 million people, this is a lion's task, but a necessary one. So in terms of benefits, the government is doing this not just because that there are physical and cognitive benefits at all, it's also a mechanism of increasing participation in schools. So Indonesia is trying to develop its workforce, trying to raise the level of education of its children, but also reduce household income stress as well. So that leads to a longer-term dividend of a more capable workforce, but of course that dividend won't be delivered until 10-15 years from now. But also, according to some colleagues who are researchers in Singapore's IESS, there is an increasing potential for food self-sufficiency if Indonesia wants to rely more on producing that food for this Free Meals Program domestically. It could reduce the carbon footprint of travel, yet to be seen, and an opportunity to focus on certain crops that are indigenous to Australia. Having said that, as you can imagine, the enormity of this Free Meals Program to deliver to these 89 million individuals just by the end of 2025 means that these meals, first and foremost, they must be nutritious. They have to have adequate protein and not just empty calories. This is not uncommon in countries with quickly developing economies that there is an extra consumption of food, fast food that has flooded the markets, cheap and available processed foods in supermarkets, because people want a share of what has traditionally been found in industrialized countries. So that is one of the challenges. The other issue, as I said earlier, stunting occurs in the first 1,000 days of a child's life. Now, the damage has already been done by age 2, and the children most likely to receive these free meals will already be in primary school. So there is a limited impact in terms of redressing the physiological changes of this issue. The downside as well, if I go back to the map in these provinces in the east there, some of you might know, have experienced conflict, ethnic tensions and unrest in many recent years. Now, this is a site where the Indonesian government is planning to develop food estates as part of its pursuit for food self-sufficiency, but also to provide the resources for these free nutritious meals programs. Now, with the army taking an increasing role in managing these food estates, one can only imagine this increased militarization also opens up the opportunity for increased tensions, and certainly if there are inequalities with the inhabitants of the Papuan region, if the benefits of this kind of food estate is not felt by their people as well. So how is this going to work? This is an enormous task, as I said earlier. There is a national nutrition agency, but essentially the analysts have said it comes down to fiscal sustainability. Now, one of the main criticisms is that they're trying to provide these millions of meals every day at the cost of about $1 Australian per lunchbox. Now, in Indonesia, that is still a relatively large amount of money. Now, the problem is that some children have already complained about the quality of the food. There was some talk about using fish milk as a means of protein, and I admire the creativity behind that, but there's also been, more seriously, 40 children in Central Java that were recently poisoned as a result of the program. So ensuring there's a quality rollout, that food safety is taken into consideration, are very simple ways that this could really derail. So there are a number of flow-on effects in terms of Indonesia's overall economic situation by virtue of this free meals program. And the first thing is that in January of this year, the Indonesian government under Prabowo instituted a number of fiscal disciplinary measures. In other words, the government cut the budgets of many of the major government departments, including the Foreign Ministry, including the Health Ministry, but most importantly also cut into the Ministry of Women's Empowerment and Child Protection and the National Commission on Violence Against Women. So again, there is this idea of you're robbing Peter to pay for Paul. And in this sense, it's very difficult that if the Prabowo government is wanting to find savings in order to pay for this free nutritious meals program, it's actually cutting into other government agencies as well. Now, some of the implications of this have included, as I have heard directly from public servants in Indonesia, having to turn the lights off at 4:30 in the afternoon, having to ration the number of elevators that you're going to use, but more importantly, a cut to a number of programs that they can undertake. For the Foreign Ministry, a cut to the number of engagement opportunities for them. The Indonesian ambassador recently took his car up to Sydney because there's no flight budget anymore. I mean, these are all of the practicalities when a central government in Indonesia is trying to raise billions of dollars in order to pay for what is inherently an important program, but this is just indicative of the challenges that face this government as well. If I want to add in that, in terms of the economic situation, the Indonesian economy is hovering just around 4.8% growth, GDP growth. This is the first time it's dipped below 5% if we put pandemic numbers to one side. There is also pressure on Indonesia's middle class, which is currently shrinking, and as we've all experienced in Australia as well, an increased cost of living. So if the government wants to raise taxes as another means of finding the revenue to pay for this free nutritious meals program, there's going to be a lot of hurt. And if history tells us anything, once the middle class of any country is distressed, or they feel that there is something to push it back against, that's when you find political instability. So for the political scientists in the room, I'm sure this is one of those things that we'll be watching in Indonesia as well. But so far so good. But these are just some of the issues that are the second and third order effects of what is inherently a very good program. So, and if we don't forget, of course, there are 32% tariffs being threatened by the United States, and the postponement of which will be up, the 90 days postponement will be up on the 8th of July, so that there is more pressure on the Indonesian government and the Indonesian economy to come. So, I don't want it to be all doomy and gloomy, but again, this is just to give you an idea that what is inherently a noble program, which will have dividends for the young of Indonesia, comes with a cost, with literally a cost, and a whole slew of challenges as well. The other issue that's been happening in Indonesia, now if we move up from the people level to the society and state level, you might have seen in the news a bit of an uproar about laws to the Indonesian military's legislation. So there have been a number of protests that have happened within the country and outside of the country. So let me just give you a little bit of background about that. That there's been concern that Indonesia is moving back towards the dual function or dui fungsi of the new era. What is all that about? So let me go back to 1966 to 1998, the height of the term of the Suharto government. That was an era when the Indonesian military had unparalleled political power and influence. Not only were they the preeminent security force within the country that had the glory of having fought for independence of the country and was seen as responsible for the integrity, sovereignty and territoriality of the Indonesian state, it was deeply embedded in the political system as well. 1/4 of the seats in parliament were reserved for the Indonesian military, and they had enormous interests within private businesses, whether that be airlines, the oil company Pertamina, hotels and brothels, but they were also heavily involved in making economic policy and served as the nation's diplomats. Now, when the East Asian financial crisis happened, and all of that came crushing down and the military experienced a deep sense of crisis about where it was going to head, many of the reformists within the Indonesian military said, we must be out. The Indonesian public has turned against us, and we no longer should play this role within society. This dual function, which had been enshrined in legislation that mandated that the military have a security role and a non-security role, was no more. And the Indonesian law number 34 of 2004 was a seminal piece of legislation that carved the lines between the civilian realm and the military realm and instituted the transition to democratization and what we would see in a democracy of what would be the civilian supremacy over the armed forces, the subordination of the armed forces, and an increased professionalization of soldiers within those confines. So within that, the dual function being eradicated, the Indonesian military, thus separated from the Indonesian police as well, tried to put itself back to barrack, to try to professionalize itself as a predominantly security force. That transition was never complete. Under successive presidents, the Indonesian military has maintained a level of influence and informal presence. Now, that has often come through the form of being advisors. When they've retired, they've sometimes become ministers. Sometimes they've sat on important boards. You can imagine in Indonesia, if you're a retired general and you're sitting on the National Sport Agency, the amount of money that's flowing there, say for instance something like the Asia Games. So very important ways, and probably not obvious ones to us in Australia, where these retired officers, and active duty as well, have points of influence. Now, in this case, under President Joko Widodo, who is President Prabowo Subianto's predecessor, there was a creeping amount of military influence, particularly in the form of retired officers becoming ministers, who were key advisors to him, heads of the National Intelligence Agency, so on and so forth. What has happened under President Prabowo is that influence has merely become formalised. So earlier this year, there were proposals to make changes to the said Law 34 of 2004. Now, there were a number of proposed revisions. Some of them were just quite practical. It stated originally that the military retirement age was 56 years old. Well, 20 years have passed and people are living longer. It would make sense, amongst other things, to extend the retirement age of military officers who have spent nothing more than their entire lives in the military and would find it very, very difficult to retrain once they hit that mid-50s age. So that was one of the practical changes. The one that has caught the attention of most of the domestic and international media has been the provision that would expand the number of civilian agencies where active military officers can have jobs. Now, there were already a number of military officers in places like the cyber agency or perhaps in another intelligence agency where one might find and expect to have the military expertise provided by such individuals. Now, the formalisation of this law was to expand that number of agencies from 10 to 16, including things like the Attorney General's office. Now, one might ask themselves, how appropriate is it to have military officers influencing the legal processes of a country? Now, in the case of the Attorney Generals, apparently there is a necessity for there to be a military expert for military law, but there are a number of other questions raised about the appropriateness of having military officers and a militarized approach and thinking in places like counter-narcotics. Now, again, there were some of these provisions that were rejected, but to the credit of the Indonesian people, the Indonesian media and civil society, there was incredible pushback against these kinds of provisions. It was not the case that the Indonesian public were happy about these particular changes. Now, let me add a contradictory statistic to that. For the last 10 years or so, from the surveys that I've tracked, the Indonesian military, particularly the army, is the most trusted institution within the country. It often has approval rates of between 75% all the way up to 95%, much higher than the president, much higher than the parliament, and much higher than the police. In fact, if I have to say, the political parties and the police are often the least trusted institutions in Indonesia, which is concerning because they are the ones that ought to reflect the public and protect the public. Now that tells you something about the standing of the military and the role that the military has had in society. There is still a territorial system which brings Indonesian army soldiers in very close contact with people all the way from the provincial level down to the village level. But that does not mean at the same time that people necessarily want the Indonesian military to have a formalised role and influence within its bureaucracy or within its parliament as well. It is not necessarily the case that retired Indonesian officers become parliamentarians any more than civilians do. So this was something, as I said, that garnered a lot of interest and a lot of attention and a lot of hoo-ha about whether this would be the return of dual function. I would say that it's kind of dual functiony, but not quite. We can maybe unpack that in the Q&A. But let me outline some of my concerns. One of the concerns is that there was not a lot of transparency about how these legislative revisions were going to be made. A lot of civil society groups said that there was not the open public debate that we might see in our parliament, and that was a concern. That was redressed towards the end, but that was certainly something that people were concerned about. The fact that 200 colonels were given training in business with the expectation that they might enter into state-owned enterprises was also something that is a concern. But if I'm just looking at the public service, for instance, if you're having military officers coming in horizontally to become managers who are trained in a culture of authority, let me put this carefully, in hierarchy, in terms of obedience, in terms of not questioning orders, it is an interesting change what impact that might have on civilian subordinates. Is it the right kind of injection that these institutions need by having an increased number of military active duty officers? And where does the line stop? I would have said after 20 years of Indonesia's democratic reform that a law revision to the military law would actually call for a decreasing number of civilian agencies where we'd find military officers. Now, there was a rationale at the beginning of Reformasi in 1998 that we would have military officers because there was not yet a civilian capacity, one that you would expect in a democracy. And that's because military officers had been running the show for a long time. So it made sense in 2004. Does it make sense in 2025? And if it doesn't, why does Indonesia lack a bureaucratic capacity, and why is it filling the job with military officers instead? And what are the second and third order effects of normalising a military presence in such civilian areas, of introducing a hierarchical system, particularly in a culture which already has deference to seniority? How much more difficult will that be? Will public servants have the ability to question certain policies and the ways in which things are made? Will the military act in accordance with its own corporate interests? We don't have any answers to these questions yet, but these are some of the things the analyst in me is putting on the table. So let me just point out another area of where the military has influence. Now, that legislation, as I said, merely formalises something that had already started under President Joko Widodo. Now, in terms of Prabowo surrounding himself with military influence, I'm going to have to... top left corner, we have the new Indonesian Foreign Minister Sugiono, former Special Forces officer. To the top right, we have the Defence Minister, longtime friend and confidant of Prabowo Subianto since their military academy days, Shafri Shamsuddin, who was once banned from coming to Australia. I know that because I used to be on the desk at Defence. Bottom left-hand corner, retired Lieutenant General Muhammad Harindra, who's former head of the intelligence agency, another former Special Forces officer. Nice guy, though. And, that was Major Teddy at the top, and Sugiono, who's the foreign minister, in the bottom corner. Now, on the right-hand side, with Shafri Shamsuddin, Prabowo's very good friend and confidant, and Sugiono down the bottom, these are people that are, particularly in Sugiono's case, he's not a career diplomat. He's not like Retno Marsudi, who came out of the foreign ministry with 10 years of serving as Jokowi's foreign minister. The signal sent by having these people are that Prabowo is surrounding himself with the inner circle of those that he trusts, and there are serious implications for the way in which Indonesia's foreign policy is being run. Which brings me to my last area, and just mindful of time, I'll come back to some of these during the Q&A. The third issue is the way in which Indonesia's foreign policy has unfolded under the Prabowo administration. Now, In the news, I'm sure that you've all seen, there's also been a hoo-ha about the prospect of Russian bases in Indonesia's province of Papua. I was happily on leave at that time, and I think my good friend Rahman took a lot of the media heat for me. But this is an issue, I think, that needs context and relates very much to Prabowo's decision to join the BRICS grouping. So just as a quick bit of background, what are the BRICS? They're an informal grouping of leading emerging economies that originally had been Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that aim to coordinate their economic and diplomatic policies. Now, very important to point out, they are not a military alliance, and they are not exclusively anti-West or anti-US necessarily, but it is no coincidence that a lot of these states are those one would consider from the global south. Now, coming back to Prabowo's decision to join BRICS, President Jokowi before him had said, this is not an urgent matter, we can put this on ice for now. Prabowo comes into the office, and within the first week, the decision is made that Indonesia will pursue full BRICS membership. So the summit in October was when Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia became official partner members, which is a step forward into full membership. And as I said, it was an abrupt change of policy from the Jokowi administration. So coming so early in Prabowo's term, yes, because the summit was on at the time, but I think it signals a willingness to play more of a role and to be active in regional groupings. Now, for those of you who know, Indonesia's core foreign policy principle is this idea of bebas aktif, free and active, or independent and active, depending on your translation. And this is Indonesia flexing that bebas active instinct. But in this case, I would also point out that the BRICS, the original grouping anyway, was about 40% of the world's population. If you now consider that BRICS has undergone several iterations of expanding that membership, that's now roughly 55% of the world's population. And as my colleague Elena Noor puts it, it's not just the global south anymore, it should be called the global majority. Now, it's interesting that Indonesia, or perhaps a natural extension of Indonesia's desire to be involved in multilateral institutions, it was a very active member of the United Nations, and on a side note, the only member to have actually left and rejoined. But it definitely boosts not only BRICS Southeast Asian credentials by having Indonesia there, it boosts Indonesia's credentials by being this active member of institutions where it feels it can exert some influence. It is completely consistent with Indonesia's non-aligned posture, which is something that it is held on to as a very dear characteristic of its Bandung Conference is the one, certainly. But interestingly enough, Indonesia has strategic hedging in its DNA, like many of the other Southeast Asian states. And by joining BRICS, it also opens up, ironically, the possibility of being able to do more with the US, with Australia, New Zealand, the EU, and other states. Now, I do want to highlight that Indonesia doesn't necessarily subscribe to all of the aspirations of BRIC leaders. Putin, for instance, wants to replace the US dollar as a dominant currency of trade. Indonesia is not on board. But like I said, the salience of Indonesia's membership is this extension of its activism, the signalling that under Prabowo that it has arrived on the international stage in a way that is more confident and bolder than it has been under his predecessor, Joko Widodo. And like I said, it is no accident that many of these states came out of the global south. Indonesia joining the BRICS feels like a natural extension of its non-aligned instincts, in particular because it was a founding member of the non-aligned movement all the way back during the Cold War. So one thing I would like to highlight before I start to wrap up is the salience of the relationship between Indonesia and China, because in the context of thinking about why would Indonesia even countenance the idea of a Russian base, we need to understand where Indonesia sits relative to the world's other emerging powers as well. So 2025 marks the 75th anniversary of diplomatic ties, the establishment of diplomatic ties between Indonesia and China. Now, if we look at those first 200 days of Prabowo's presidency, where did he go first? Beijing. Now, he also visited a bunch of other countries at the time, but it is important that that particular trip that he took when he went to Beijing yielded $15 billion worth of deals. Now, if we go back to the economic challenges that Prabowo will face in terms of his free nutritious meals program, looking at the behavior on the international stage starts to make a lot of sense. There's a lot of pragmatism there as well. Now, if we look at the rest of the visits, during that same trip, he did go to the US to meet with President Biden. That was a neat little balancing act of Indonesia, not uncommon as well. But then he went to Peru for APEC, he went to Brazil for the G20, the UK, and the UAE. Notably, again in January this year, Prabowo was the guest of honour at India's Republic Day, where he was with his best buddy Modi, and they called each other brother. This is on the record. An Indonesian military contingent took part in the grand parade. Sorry, I got some fancy photos for that. There he is with the Indian president as well, not the Prime Minister, the president there. And in the same trip, he also visited the UAE, Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, and Jordan. In Turkey, he delivered a speech before the Turkish parliament. He visited the Antalya Diplomacy Forum, signed a joint statement of strategic partnership with Egypt, and then, like I said earlier, he made Indonesia's representations at APEC and the G20. So there is a clear desire to signal an increase of this activism, visibility outside the Indo-Pacific. And besides visiting Malaysia, it really struck me that Prabowo Subianto has not spent any time substantially in Southeast Asia, nor has he spent much time in Japan or Korea as well. So I find that rather curious. But there are obviously sensible economic drivers, as I said earlier. $15 billion with the Chinese is nothing to sniff at, but also the ability to be able to find other opportunities, increasing defence cooperation with Turkey, looking at India, how India feeds its school children, and a number of other ways in which Prabowo can build a sense of solidarity with countries across the Middle East in pursuit of his pro-Palestinian, pro-Gaza policy, which at the same time balances a complicated relationship with Israel. But it is certainly the mark of free and active, and I would almost say free and activist. Now, setting the economic drivers and the signalling to one side, as I said earlier, there are deep historical roots to this kind of behaviour. The genesis of this non-alignment, these instincts, go all the way back to Indonesia's first president, Sukarno, whose sense of proud, anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist instincts had led him to foster good personal relationships with a number of the world's emerging power. He wanted Indonesia to take its place on the international scene. There is he with Mao Zedong. There he is hanging out with JFK, which looks remarkably like this photo as well. So there you have it. So I would also say, setting aside for those historic reasons, there are other factors in the international realm that do give rise, or perhaps give Prabowo more reason to develop more of these relationships, and one, of course, is the new US administration. It is not necessarily a case that Indonesia is turning away from the West. It is seeking other opportunities. And indeed, when the French President Macron will visit Singapore to deliver his keynote speech at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue, you can bet that Indonesia is going to be on his visit list as well. Now, within that time I've given, I hope I've given you a cross-section, because Indonesia, as we know, a country of 280 million people, has no shortage of complex issues to tackle. If I had to give a complete scorecard of Prabowo's 200 days, we would be here from us. And of course, just to highlight a couple of things for all of you as Indonesian enthusiasts to keep abreast of, certainly coalition politics, mining nickel and lithium, which is incidentally key for Australia. I haven't even touched on issues of environmental protection, the shrinking of the middle class I touched on, what's happening with Nusantara, the new capital, the conflict in Papua, the conflict in Gaza, the impact of AI on Indonesia's ability to be able to create new jobs, the rivalry between the military and police. There's a lot going on, and there's a lot to learn. But tonight we've touched on three main areas. But of course it comes down to this. What does this mean for Australia? And what should we do amidst all of this complexity? So as Ian has mentioned, our dear Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is currently or on his way to visit Jakarta after his publicised phone call asking Prabowo if he could do such a thing. What we know so far is that Albanese appears to have a good working relationship with Prabowo, but Prabowo, by virtue of his 4 years or so as Defence Minister, actually has good relations with the man in the background. That's our current Defence Minister and State Defence Minister, Richard Marles. So there are a couple of positive contact points there between the current administration and ours. And if you think about the administration tenures, that's an interesting point as well. Prabowo has been elected in 2025, 2024, and will serve until 2029. Anthony Albanese first became Prime Minister in 2022, and notwithstanding any leadership skills, will be there to about 2028 or so, if I anticipate. Those two overlapping leaderships are an opportunity for Australia to further cement continuity between our two countries, or at least provide a sense of stability. Now, I went through people, state, and then international. I'm going to go the other way around in terms of my recommendations. So I'm actually going to borrow from our good friend, Dr. Gacha Priyandita at ASPI. Now, Gacha wrote recently on The Strategist, I believe it was yesterday, for those of you who want to go look it up. He said, Australia is comfortable with hard-edged strategic competition. Indonesia is not. This difference in worldviews can't be papered over with warm language or economic initiatives. It needs to be acknowledged, discussed, and managed. Now, that is the first bit of advice that I would have for our returning government, let me put it that way. I think that we are at a point of maturity in Australia-Indonesia relations where we should start tackling more of the difficult issues, and we should talk where we have opportunities and be honest about where we have differences. That's not necessarily a new or groundbreaking formulation, but I think it's worth iterating nevertheless. Let me give you an example in terms of optics. Prabowo Subianto had a phone call congratulating the new US president in January. If you listen to that phone call, the power dynamics are clear. He consistently calls him sir. He consistently says, I'll come to wherever you are. Now, if you listen to the call between Anthony Albanese and Prabowo the other day, the tone is different. So just reflect on that if you have a chance. Their both calls are on Prabowo's Instagram account. But the point is, it's time to tackle the bigger stuff, not just the low-hanging fruit. We need to avoid the perception as well that we belong in one block and not in another. Now, to this end, what more could we do other than just the government-to-government level? There's a lot to be done at Track 2 and Track 3. So Track 2 is the informal side of things, and Track 3 are those people-to-people ties. Civil society in Indonesia has a voice. Both the government and Australian civil society must help in investing in capacity building, educating groups about rights, and building solidarity between those civil society organisations. If you look at global trends, things like Radio Free Asia have closed several branches in Southeast Asia, and the related website Benar News has paused operations for lack of funds. We need to support a free press, not just in our country, but in our region as well. DFAT has already a number of very good scholarships to support Indonesian journalists, but I think there's more we can do, not only to support journalists there, but to encourage the presence of our reporters in the region as well. The policy and business community as well have a role. Obviously, there are opportunities to help invest in Indonesia. As I said earlier, Prabowo will be looking for investors, not just within the Free Meals Program, but in terms of infrastructure and health. We need to look where we have more economic complementarities. Having said that, we are going to have to be more and more creative. Indonesia is building food self-sufficiency, so that may not mean that our traditional complementarity of shipping certain kinds of food commodities to Indonesia will necessarily work in years to come. And also, one of the issues that have come up with the Free Meals program is that Indonesian children are mostly lactose intolerant. So us trying to supplement their protein deficiencies by exporting milk isn't really appropriate in that case. But that said, I would say that there is a place for marketing sambal sausage rolls. So last but not least, to the Australian public, I would say don't panic. Don't panic about things like the Indonesia and the Russian base. Take the time to understand Indonesia's history, Indonesia's own domestic constraints, and a lot of this stuff will make sense. And for that matter, we need not only more journalists to take interest in Indonesia, but more at universities, which I know are already under pressure, but we also need that leadership to come from community leaders and our politicians as well. And to all of you, I say, please read, and read widely. I have a selection of novels by Indonesian authors. I can provide those names to you later as well. A good book on CIA covert operations, which helps you understand the national psyche and the sensitivity to flagrant US power in Southeast Asia. Need I not even mention Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. And last but not least, if you're not much of a reader, go to Netflix. There's no shortage of Indonesian stuff there as well. I can't make it any easier. All right, just to sum up, President Prabowo in his first 200 days has invested heavily in domestic welfare, but there is a challenges of resources and how those resources will be managed. There are concerns about increasing military influence within the bureaucracy and the state, concerns about a return to the new order. As I argued, I think some of those concerns are partially justified, but there is a context of wider democratic backsliding in Southeast Asia. If you look at Prabowo's foreign policy behaviour in his first trips as soon as he's become president, it looks like a bebas active flex, but really you can understand that in the context of Indonesia's desire to find economic opportunities, but very much its strategic hedging and non-aligned instincts as well. And last but not least, I would say, as not the only one to say so, it's time to level up in Australia-Indonesia relations, and could that even look like having an Indonesia strategy as well? So one last thing to say from a colleague writing in the AFR is that Prabowo, let me quote this, one problem with Prabowo is that it's never clear whether he means what he says. Eager to please, he tends to tell people what they want to hear. He could always reverse himself, whether on South China Sea or on coal. Now, I think that's true to some degree. There is still a level of wait and see. Prabowo is a highly educated individual, a highly motivated person to become a strong leader, and he could be capricious under certain circumstances. But there are a lot of strategic instincts with Indonesia. There are a lot of domestic challenges that remain the same. As I always say, the homework for an Indonesian president is consistent from one administration to another. Where Australia's place is within all of that is up to us. Thank you.